Good afternoon. I'm told it's time to start again. I'm Bill Propp. I am one of the professors at UCSD in the Judaic Studies program and the Department of History. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of this session. He's Richard Friedman, currently at the University of Georgia, but formerly my colleague who hired me here, the former Katzen Professor of Jewish Civilization at the University of California, San Diego. So I'll just invite him up so I don't intrude into his time.
It's been a long day. I'm just going to tell jokes. How do you know if they're jokes? Moses walks into a psychiatrist's office. He says, "Doc, last night I dreamed I was the Ohel Moed." He comes in the next day. He says, "Last night I dreamed I was the Mishkan." The doctor says, "Your problem is you're too tense." Will some of you explain that to the people next to you? It's freezing in here, and I kept having to go in and out myself, and I want to apologize to several of you who know I walked in and out during your talks. You're my colleagues, and I'm embarrassed that I had to do that, and I feel like Moses, who Lahavdil, who had to go up and down Mount Sinai. You all know the scene. God says, "Aleh," and Moses goes up, and what is the first thing God says to him? "Red," and he goes back down. I'm not, so I felt like that. But, people judge you by the company you keep. I mean to make the point that the written sources that gave us the story of the Exodus in the first place still provide us with our best evidence on this subject. I thought that I had moved on from source criticism to other things years ago, but like Michael Corleone in Godfather 3, every time I thought I was out, they pull me back in. Combining what serious source analysis gives us with what archaeology might be able to add is our best shot at getting at the Exodus. But we live in an age when there is so much new data available to us that hardly anyone can control it. There are few like my teacher, G.E. Wright, or his teacher, Albright, who can handle both those written sources and the archaeology. So the works in our field in this subject, with just a few exceptions, either just deal with one or the other, or else become an unsophisticated tohu vavohu of the two, as we have seen here. That is why our coming together in this meeting is so important. When some of our colleagues say that a detail in a text story of the Exodus reflects a concern of a later period, okay, let's grant that. When they say that a location in the story reflects a location of a later time, okay, let's grant that. But these have nothing to do with whether the story is based on something that happened. They only shed light on the way in which the authors wrote their version of the story of what happened, or maybe even just on what details or locations some editors added or modified. So they don't tell us when the story was written. Did a couple of you who spoke today hear that? Some say we've combed the Sinai and haven't found physical evidence, but even if we grant that too, what on earth makes them think that people traveling from Egypt to Israel 3,200 years ago would have left anything that we would find now? A piece of petrified wood with Moshe Ohev Tzipora carved in it? Oh, but they're looking for evidence of a great mass of people. My friends Yisrael and Neil correctly introduced their discussion with the heading, "Was a mass exodus even possible in the time of Ramses II?" But our oldest sources of this, the Song of the Sea and J, the Song of the Sea is our oldest source on this. There seemed to be some misunderstanding about that earlier. And our second oldest is J. Don't give any numbers. There is no mass of millions in their Exodus stories. I'll get to E a little later. And few of us who do the scholarship on early Israel, whatever our models, imagine that the whole of Israel experienced the Exodus. We get that the list of numbers with 600,000 males from all of Israel's tribes just might, have been added to the original story. Where do the big specific numbers appear? In the source known as P, which is at best the fourth version of the story to be written. Yisrael and Neal wrote that even if the number is exaggerated, quote, the text describes the survival of a great number of people under the most challenging conditions. Some archaeological traces of their generation-long wandering in the Sinai should be apparent. So if you grant their two assumptions, that it was a large mass of people and then it went on for an entire generation, say 40 years, I guess. I lost my place. Then, yeah, maybe they have a point. But there is absolutely zero basis for the first two assumptions. From our oldest texts, we have no idea how many people would have been involved, and we have no reason whatever to accept uncritically a claim that it went on for a whole generation. And I mean no disrespect to my archaeological colleagues when I express my skepticism about that last assumption as well. Just because they couldn't find evidence doesn't prove or disprove a darned thing about anything except maybe a mass exodus. And for heaven's sake, did we need archaeological work to confirm that an exodus of 2 million was problematic? It had already been calculated long ago that if they were marching, say, 8 across, then when the first ones got to Sinai, half of the people were still in Egypt. And I think it was Bishop Colenso who calculated around 150 years ago the amount of, let's say delicately, residue that many people would have deposited in the Sinai over a period of 40 years, and he concluded that the Sinai wilderness should be fertile. Did we really need archaeologists combing the Sinai and finding nothing to prove what we knew anyway? 90% of the argument is based on the fact that we haven't found anything. No artifacts in Egypt or the Sinai, few items of Egyptian material culture among the early Israelite sites. It's not the same as the question of the conquest, where the absence of destruction layers, where there certainly should be some, really indicates that there was no conquest. The absence of exodus and wilderness artifacts questions only whether there was a massive exodus. So some eventually take a more cautious position. Many say the exodus may have happened, but not in the time and manner in the text. Oh my God, thank heavens that we examined all those sites in Egypt and the Sinai so we could conclude that the sun was not actually blacked out for 3 days and the sticks didn't magically turn into snakes. We're living in a great age in which we have achieved archaeological confirmation of the obvious. And when Egyptologists or archaeologists attempt to work with the text and do a kind of source criticism, it gets worse. When our colleagues Redford or Finkelstein date the composition of the texts about the Exodus to the 7th or even 6th century BCE because they say some details or places in the story reflect that century, and when others date it even later, they have to feel compelled at least to try to explain how those places and details found their way into texts that show so many signs of having been composed during the time when both Israel and Judah existed as two countries side by side, which is between the 10th and 8th centuries. And when Redford and others even say that our lengthy and detailed account of Moses and all his roles is late, either exilic or post-exilic, they likewise have to at least mention the fact that those accounts are in sources written in classical pre-exilic Hebrew. What this shows is that to do this seriously, we have to pay attention to the sources and to know as much as possible about who wrote which ones, when, and why, or to put it in a familiar phrase, we need to know who wrote the Bible. Somebody should write. So here is a scenario based on the sources themselves. The earliest prose sources are J and E. I'm not referring today to recent models that claim that J and E are very late sources, exilic, Persian, Hellenistic, or supplementary sources, or that they're not even two separate sources, or that they're not continuous sources at all, because those models are poorly defended and, to my mind, indefensible. We've given them more than a fair hearing, which is what honest scholars do, and that's all that's come of it was a massive, often weak, and almost always non-responsive scholarship, and in some cases, childish behavior that has demeaned the field. So let me say, as a Wiederaufnahme, the earliest prose sources are J and E. And what was the first best-known piece of evidence that identified the existence of these two sources? God's name. People who don't know better still keep referring to this as a problem of, quote, the names of God. That's their first mistake. The evidence was never that God has different names in different sources. It was that sources give different pictures of when God's name, Yahweh, was revealed. In ENP, the name Yahweh is first revealed to Moses and not known to humans before that. So in E and P, God is called Elohim or El Shaddai consistently until he reveals that his name is Yahweh to Moses, and after that he is referred to by this name as well as by Elohim. But in J, the name Yahweh is known from the beginning. It is first used by Eve. Moreover, the narrator in the J source never once refers to the deity as Elohim. People only thought that it was a matter of different names in different sources because the original work was done by Jan Astruc and Henning Witter, who worked only through Genesis, and people still usually work through Genesis first. It is only at the burning bush in Exodus 3 in E, and it is only in Egypt in Exodus 6 in P that we find out what the name thing had been about all along. It is about when God first reveals to Moses that his name is Yahweh, not Yahweh. Moses was not an Ashkenazi. But it has been 200 years since Astruc, and at least some of us have read the Bible as far as Exodus, so we should have it down now. A second mistake that people commonly make is that they imagine that we just circularly call any verse with the name Yahweh in it J, and any verse with El or Elohim in it E or P, and then we claim, look, it's consistent. But that is not how it works at all. The passages in which the words Yahweh, El, and Elohim occur have to come out consistent with all of the other evidence for identifying the passages as J or E or P. The unbroken continuity of narrative texts, the consistent use of other characteristics terms, at least 20 of them through 460 occurrences, the division of twice-told stories, doublets, with the terms Yahweh or Elohim appearing consistently in one or the other of the two stories, the links between the two stories in each account with the era and history that each reflects, the connection between the stories in each account with the connection between the respective sources with other parts of the Bible, for example, J with the court history, P with Ezekiel, and the multiple connections of the source J to the southern kingdom of Judah and the source E to the northern kingdom of Israel. No scholar is clever enough to make all of that work, not even me, no scholar is clever enough to make all of that work consistently and still have the name of God always in the right place. Just how carefully, consistently is this distinction in the revelation of the divine name developed? In 2,000 occurrences of El, Elohim, and Yahweh in the Masoretic text of the Torah, there are just 3 exceptions. There are differences in the Septuagint, which is no surprise, since translators can easily substitute Kurios or Theos for Yahweh or Elohim and vice versa. But in the Dead Sea texts from Qumran, which are Hebrew texts 1,000 years older than the Masoretic text, older than the Leningrad Codex, the picture is the same as the Masoretic text, especially consistent with regard to the name of God. Only 2 verses have Elohim at Qumran, where it is Yahweh in the Masoretic text. And as it happens, they are verses that do not contradict the hypothesis in any case. So the significance of this source distinction concerning the doctrine that God's name was not revealed until Moses remains unrefuted and underappreciated. It proved to be helpful as a first clue that led us on a trail of working out who wrote the Bible. If it had just done that and nothing more, it would have been an interesting observation in itself and as a matter of history of scholarship, dayenu. But the real point is to go further and ask, now what might be the reason for this? Why did 2 important writers of the Bible, the writers of E and P, develop the idea that Israel's God did not reveal his name to humans until the time of Moses and the Exodus? We attribute these sources, E and P, to Levite writers. Writers from 2 different Levite groups, possibly one Mushite and one Aaronid, but both Levite in any case. Few, if any, of us would attribute J to a Levite writer. The Levite priestly concerns of E and P are just not there. This fits with the possible scenario that a number of us, including me, are testing, that not all of the Israelites are part of the Egypt experience, only the Levites. This is consistent with the evidence of the Song of Deborah, which in San Diego, the land of David Noel Friedman, Zichrono Livracha, is not doubted to be one of the 2 oldest things in the Bible, though I learned otherwise today. In the 12th or 11th century BCE, this song lists the names of the tribes of Israel and does not include Levi. Why? Either 1, because the Levites were not there yet, they were in Egypt or on the road, or 2, they were not a tribe of Israel, they were a priestly group. One might respond that choice 2, that they were not a tribe but rather priests, is enough. That still doesn't connect them with Egypt or an Exodus. But there's also the fact that some of the Levites have Egyptian names, like Hophni, 2 men named Pinchas, and of course Moses. And their description of their priestly tabernacle contains parallels with the battle tent of Pharaoh Ramses II, as was shown in a dissertation that our former student Michael Homan wrote here at UCSD under both Professor Levy and Professor Propp. Also, it is the three sources that come from the Levites, E, P, and D, that tell the story of the plagues and exodus from Egypt. In both my identification of the sources and Professor Propp's, at which we arrived independently, though we're friends, these accounts in Exodus are from E and P. J, meanwhile, jumps from Moses saying, "Let my people go," to the event at the Red Sea. Who knows what story, if any, came between? J rather spends far more space on the era of the patriarchs, that is, the pre-Egypt period, while E spends far more on the era of Moses, and P spends so much on that Mosaic era and so little on the pre-Egypt patriarchal era that Frank Cross drew the conclusion that P was not a narrative source. I never agreed with my teacher, Professor Cross, on that point, but I understand why, again, opening the Bible first to Genesis, even a superior scholar would see a sparse narrative from P and conclude that this was not a full narrative source. But everything changes in P when that source gets to Egypt, where there is plenty of narrative. It is the Levites who had the Egypt connections, reflected in their names, their architecture, and the history and holidays that they taught their people. They taught them to practice circumcision, as was practiced in Egypt, which is required only in the Levite priestly covenant with Abraham in Genesis 17 and in the Levite priestly law in Leviticus 12. They use the metaphor of circumcision of the heart, which is found in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy and the Levite prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and they use the metaphor of Moses' uncircumcised lips, and Jeremiah adds the metaphor of uncircumcised ears. All 11 of these references appear only in these Levite sources. The non-Levite source, J, meanwhile knows nothing about circumcision except to say that Zipporah once did something to somebody for some reason at a Malone on the way to Egypt. And so for those who argue that if there had been an exodus, then there should be more signs of Egyptian material culture in early Israel, that argument too has substance only if we're still stuck back at the 2 million number and all of Israel participating in the exodus. If it was just the Levites, the Egyptian cultural influences are present. And meanwhile, in the Song of the Sea, the other of the two oldest things in the Bible, no matter from what group it originated, the God who is associated with the group in Egypt in that song is named 9 times, and in all 9 the name is Yahweh. And note this, the Song of the Sea never speaks of the whole nation of Israel. The word Israel does not occur in it. The Am, whom Yahweh leads from the sea to his sacred abode, is not specified, and he does not lead them to the whole land. He plants them in his legacy's mountain, at his mikdash, where his throne's platform is, a phrase that occurs only in the Song of the Sea and in reference to the temple in Solomon's dedication speech. This makes sense if we're reading about Levites. It does not refer on the face of it to all of Israel. So Deborah, which is set in Israel, doesn't mention the Levites, and the Song of the Sea, which is set in Egypt, doesn't mention all of Israel. Likewise, when colleagues say that there couldn't have been an exodus and journey to the land during the time between Ramses II and Merneptah, because Egypt, by the way, that picture of Merneptah up there, I'm freezing, and I looked at him, and he looked the way I feel. I just got that off my chest. Want to hear a song? J and E and P and D wrote the Bible. See, in Germany, you can't sing that song. Tell Ralph Rentdorf I sang that song. Okay. For those who say that the journey couldn't take place because during that time between Ramses II and Merneptah, I'm sorry, I'll always interrupt with a joke. My career has been cursed that my digressions are better than my scholarship, so I just, because they'd fortified control of the region that period, they're still thinking of all of Israel making the journey. Since Merneptah's stela has Israel in the land, the journey, these scholars conclude, had to have taken place before that. But if, as our earliest sources suggest, Israel is in the land while just the Levites were making the journey, that journey could have been at another time. So, on the evidence of the 2 oldest works of poetry and the 2 oldest works of prose in the Hebrew Bible, the suggested scenario that lies consistently behind all of these is the Levites were in Egypt. They left in the 13th or 12th century. They came to worship a god named Yahweh, possibly under the influence of a Midianite religious connection, which J and E reported, and P did everything possible to undermine, leaving out Moses' stay in Midian, reporting that Moses ordered the destruction of the Midianites and especially the execution of their women. And how did he explain that to Zipporah? Or possibly these Levites came to it themselves. They arrived in the land where they found Israelite tribes with whom they felt kinship or with whom they chose to connect because of their political and military status. The Israelite tribes already had territories and weren't about to give up any of their land to these newcomers, kinship or not. These Levites were not people to whom one said no. The stories about them in 4 different sources connect them with violence. Levi is one of the 2 brothers who massacre the men of Shechem and Jay. Levi is cursed for his violence in Jacob's deathbed testament, which incidentally is possibly the 3rd oldest thing in the Bible. The Levites massacre the people who are associated with the golden calf in E, and the blessing of Moses, Deuteronomy 33, which incidentally is also one of those oldest things in the Bible, asks God to, quote, pierce Levi's adversaries' hips and those who hate him so they won't get up. You don't mess with the Levites. So a compact is reached. Already? Okay, I'm in trouble. You're all in trouble. I'm going to finish this. So a compact is reached. The Levites have no tribal territory, but they get a few cities and 10% of the Israelite tribe's produce. And then this is set in the context of religion. The Levites collect their 10% in their role as the priests and teachers of Israel. But priests of what God? El is their chief god of the land. So is it to be El or Yahweh? Israel had options. They could have chosen to worship both. They could have chosen one or the other. They could have said that El is Yahweh's father or his son. But they chose none of these. They said El is Yahweh. He was always Yahweh, but the Israelites in the land had not known his name because he didn't reveal his name until there were these Levites who came from Egypt to Israel. He revealed it to his greatest prophet, their leader Moses. The Levite sources E and P mentioned this story as a crucial development in their history, but the author of the J source, who was living in the same period, the 10th to 8th century, long after the acceptance of Yahweh as the proper name of God, and who was not a Levite priest, couldn't care less about when it started, and so just told the story without including that transition. That, too, may be why the Song of Deborah includes the name of Yahweh and twice identifies him as God of Israel, even though the Song of Deborah does not mention the Levites. Either the Levites were still in Egypt, and our text of the song is an adaptation of a song that originally didn't name Yahweh, just as Jay telescoped the name back in prose accounts, or perhaps the Levites had arrived and had taken up their priestly rather than tribal military muster identity. Or perhaps it is precisely the Levites who are the singers of the song to Deborah. The prose narrator attributes it to Deborah and Barak themselves, but that has always been recognized to conflict with the fact that the song speaks to Deborah and Barak in 2nd person. In any case, the Levites' roles as teachers is noted in the blessing of Moses. It says, they'll teach your judgments to Jacob and your Torah to Israel. And the priestly source retains it. According to P, the role of priests is to teach, lehorot, what God spoke through Moses. And the Levites, as the teachers of the religion, taught everyone about the wonderful, miraculous departure from Egypt. And within relatively few generations, they had everyone growing up with the story and sharing in it. They wrote it in what became the book of Exodus. There, the Levite author of E wrote, and it will be when your child will ask you tomorrow, saying, what is this? That you'll say to him, with strength of hand, Yahweh brought us out from Egypt, from a house of slaves. They wrote in Deuteronomy, another Levite source, when your child will ask you tomorrow, saying, what are the testimonies and the laws and the judgments that Yahweh our God commanded you? Then you shall say to your child, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and Yahweh brought us out from Egypt with a strong hand, and Yahweh put great and harsh signs and wonders in Egypt at Pharaoh and all of his household before our eyes, and he brought us out from there in order to bring us, to give us the land that he swore to our fathers. They taught the people that they had to take from the first all fruit of their legacy and set it before their God and share their bounty with the Levites. And when they would do the ceremony, the people, you know what they had to say. My father was a wandering Aramaean, and he brought us out. And they taught the people these things called the 10 Commandments, and the premise that preceded all of them was, I am Yahweh your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt from a house of slaves. How long did the Levites have to teach these doctrines and these practices? 1 generation, 2, 3, before all the children in Israel grew up with them, accepting them as their own history and legacy. When your child asks what it's all about, you're to say, Yahweh brought us out from Egypt. Our colleague Ron Hendel has compared this to the widespread observance of Thanksgiving by Americans. Not many of us are descended from Pilgrims or Native Americans, but most of us have come to participate in some way in the event, especially Black Friday. The specific event, the first... Take that off my time. The first Thanksgiving dinner in the story may not even be factual, but its historical background is. But the acceptance of the doctrine that all of Israel, and not just a small portion of it, had come from Egypt, required two more corollaries. First, it meant that the group who had experienced the slavery and exodus had to have been much larger. So at least 2 centuries after such an arrival of Levites would have occurred, the Levite e-source had the Pharaoh say, they are more numerous and powerful than we. And it added, the more they degraded it, the more it increased and the more it expanded. And it added, and the people increased and they became very powerful. And by the end of the plagues, it concluded the men, apart from the infants, were about 600,000. That opened the door for another Levite priestly source, P, after another century or two had passed, to include a census and get the number up to 603,550 adult males, from which they derived a total of some 2 million, whom our archaeological colleagues have been laboring in vain to find. And the second corollary of the acceptance that all of Israel, and not just a small portion of it, had come from Egypt, was that it opened a question of how they had all come to be living all over the land. That could be what prompted both the priestly Levites and the author of the non-Levite sources of the book of Joshua to imagine that there had to have been a great conquest, when so much of our archaeological evidence indicates that no such arrival of conquering masses ever took place. And our earliest source, the Song of the Sea, doesn't mention it. I have no doubt that these 2 main sources of the book of Joshua are J and P. But even for those who persist in denying this, against all the evidence, one must at least acknowledge that one of these is a Levite priestly source, and one is a source that does not show signs of coming from a priestly author, and both have passed through the hands of a Deuteronomistic editor who is from a Levite priestly group as well. That is, once the doctrine that all of Israel had come from Egyptian slavery and an exodus was accepted, all the authors, lay or Levite, signed on to the story of the conquest. And the non-Levite source, which I identify as J, which had no law of circumcision, introduced the idea that Joshua circumcised all of Israel in preparation for that conquest. They needed the mass numbers, they needed the conquest, and they needed circumcision. The evidence that there was no conquest argues against the historicity of a mass exodus, but it is consistent with this entire picture of an exodus of a smaller group who then transformed and taught it as the experience and heritage of all Israel. Last few sentences. So the model is, there was an exodus. There was not a conquest. There was an introduction and merger of Yahweh, the God of the Exodus experience, with El, the God of the Israelite experience in Canaan. That merger had to have been, a crucial step among the steps of the formation of monotheism. Whether you think that that ultimate formation was a Hezekiah Josianic exilic earlier or later, it is hard to see how it would have happened if Yahweh and El had long been 2 distinct gods of Israel. If there was an exodus, it was necessarily small in numbers. Does it really ruin your day if the exodus was historical, but not all of the Israelites were in it? It was more than an escape or even a liberation. It was, unknown to the people who experienced it, a necessary component of a historical development whose consequences we are still laboring to judge.
Oh boy. Well, I'm sure there are a few questions or responses, although we only have time for 1 or 2 at most. Anybody want to?
Can I
yes.
pick who I want?
Oh, can you pick who you want?
Kidding,
No, that's my job.
Gary Rensburg. Dick, thank you. That was just wonderful, the way you laid it all out so clearly. In the middle of your prose, I believe I caught notice of certain holidays from Egypt that the Levites brought into Israel as well. Could you be more explicit?
Yeah, I didn't have time to,
What, can you tell me what you're talking about specifically?
Well, Pesach, they would have naturally come from them. Now, I admit, J in its 10 Commandments has Pesach as well. But they also have holidays that may or may not reflect the Egyptian experience, like, whether you think Sukkot or Shavuot are that or were already local in the land. I didn't want to make a big deal of the holiday thing. But
Okay, I didn't think you were.
I am ultimately deriving Pesach, of course.
No, I'm looking for Egyptian holidays that we have some knowledge of.
No, I did not mean that.
Okay, thanks.
One more question, please, Conrad.
Thank you very much. I have one question, especially pertaining to our topic. If one follows the documentary hypothesis, there is the assumption that already in the oldest sources, like J and E, the Exodus story is but a second act in the foundational history of ancient Israel. The champions of the documentary hypothesis in 19th and early 20th century Germany, like Wellhausen and Gunkel, they actually claimed that there were sources behind the sources. So the author J did not write the work J, but J relied on earlier sources. What's your take on the prehistory of the sources? Is there a literary or just an oral prehistory to the sources? How would you answer that question, especially regarding the Exodus story?
Look, I hate all discussions of oral literature, and I've never once given a lecture in 37 years where someone in a lay audience wouldn't ask about oral prehistory and assume that there was oral history and ask me about it. And I've learned that without a time machine, it's really hard to do oral history. Prehistory of sources. So on the one hand, did the author of J or the author of P make up the Exodus completely whole cloth? No, no way, impossible. Sometimes we can see their sources. I mean, I think both Cross and Halpern have shown that the source that J used, the author of J used to describe the event at the Red Sea in prose was the Song of the Sea, which was known to them either orally or on a piece of parchment that had already been around. And likewise, the story of Deborah in Judges 4, you can see that the historian's source is the Song of Deborah in Judges 5. So sometimes I think we can get at their sources because we've got them. Sometimes we have to assume it. When the author of E writes the story of Exodus, if this is a Levite priest, which I'm sure it is, this is a person who great-grandpa was there. When the author of P writes, though, it's different, because the author of P, I really know what his sources were, and it's the combined already J.E. source. I think that was shown by Mowinckel a long time ago. It's the most unfairly disregarded piece of Bible scholarship, I think, in the history of our field. Some people credit me with it and then attack me, but Mowinckel is my Handel, you know. He's the one, Naaman to Handel. That's become a theme this weekend. I'm sorry, Ron. It's just going to keep happening. So there I know of written sources behind the author, plus interests of stories that he just made up out of whole cloth. There's plenty of evidence that the author of J and of E made up stuff out of whole cloth, too. The author of E made up the golden calf, for heaven's sake. But the author of E did not make up that there were Israelite slaves in Egypt and that there was a man named, I don't know, Moses, who let them out.
Thank you very much.